September 8, 1945. Rabaul, New Guinea. The monsoon rains have finally ceased, leaving the air thick with humidity and the smell of wet earth mixed with the ever-present odor of jungle rot and diesel fuel. In a compound of hastily erected tents surrounded by barbed wire, 237 Japanese women sit in rows on the ground, their backs rigid despite exhaustion, their faces carefully blank despite the terror that churns beneath the surface. These are the comfort women, the nurses, the civilian administrators, the telegraphists and typists who followed the Imperial Japanese Army across the Pacific, who believed in the divine mission of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, who never imagined they would survive to see this day of surrender. Among them is Kimiko Tanaka, 23 years old, a former nurse from Osaka who spent 3 years tending to wounded soldiers on Bougainville before the final collapse. Her hands, once steady as they sutured wounds and administered morphine, now tremble uncontrollably. She has not eaten a full meal in 4 months. She has not bathed in 3 weeks. She expects execution or perhaps something worse, because the stories told by Japanese propaganda about what the Americans do to female prisoners are too horrific to speak aloud. She has a small cyanide capsule hidden in the hem of her uniform, a final escape if the torture becomes unbearable. She has already decided she will use it. Within 2 hours, Kimiko will hear American music for the first time in her life. And that music, filtering through the wet canvas of the tent from a portable radio operated by bored GIs, will shatter every certainty she has carried for 23 years. She will cry, not from fear or pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that everything she was taught about the enemy, about the world, about the nature of civilization itself, was a carefully constructed lie. This is not a story about surrender. This is a story about the moment when sound becomes subversion, when melody becomes revolution, when a woman raised to believe in totalitarian order confronts the chaotic, abundant, undeniable joy of democratic freedom, and finds her entire worldview crumbling like ash in the rain. To understand that would come, one must first understand the world that shaped Kimiko Tanaka and the hundreds of thousands of Japanese women who served the imperial military machine. From the moment a Japanese girl entered elementary school in the 1920s and 1930s, she was taught that her role was one of total subordination, to her father, to her husband, to the emperor, and to the state. The concept of Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, defined the boundaries of acceptable female ambition. A woman existed to produce healthy children for the nation, to support male endeavors without complaint, to embody the virtues of patience, sacrifice, and absolute obedience. But war expanded those boundaries, not from any feminist impulse but from sheer necessity. As Japanese men were conscripted by the millions to fight across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, women were mobilized to fill the gaps. They became nurses, factory workers, agricultural laborers, and clerical staff for the military bureaucracy. Some, like Kimiko, volunteered out of patriotic fervor, genuinely believing they were contributing to the sacred mission of liberating Asia from Western colonialism. Others were conscripted, given no choice, their labor extracted by a state that had perfected the machinery of total mobilization. Kimiko had volunteered in 1942, at age 20, moved by the stirring speeches about duty and sacrifice, by the newsreels showing victorious Japanese forces sweeping across the Pacific, by the promise that her nursing skills would save the lives of brave soldiers fighting for the emperor. She completed accelerated training in Osaka, learned to treat gunshot wounds, tropical diseases, and amputations with limited supplies. She learned to bow deeply to officers, to never question orders, to maintain absolute silence about anything she witnessed. She learned that comfort and mercy were luxuries the nation could not afford in this total war for survival. In 1943, she was shipped to Rabaul, the massive Japanese base in New Guinea, a fortress carved from jungle and coral, home to 100,000 troops and the staging ground for operations across the South Pacific. She worked 18-hour shifts in the base hospital, treating men with malaria, dysentery, gangrenous wounds, and the psychological fractures that no amount of military discipline could fully suppress. She saw boys die crying for their mothers. She saw officers weep in private before composing themselves and returning to barking orders. She saw the slow erosion of the certainty that had once animated everyone, the conviction that Japan was invincible, that the emperor was divine, that victory was foreordained. But even as doubt crept in, even as supplies dwindled and the wounded multiplied, Kimiko never questioned the fundamental narrative. The Americans were the enemy, barbaric materialists without culture or honor, and if Japan was suffering, it was because the Americans fought without rules, without humanity. Every atrocity story reinforced this belief. Americans tortured prisoners, mutilated the dead, raped women without mercy. The propaganda was specific, visceral, designed to ensure that surrender was never considered an option. Death was preferable to capture. Suicide was preferable to dishonor. And then the bombs fell, and the emperor spoke, and the unthinkable became reality. Japan had surrendered. The days after August 15, 1945, were a chaos of confusion and terror for the Japanese personnel stranded across the Pacific. Some units, believing the surrender announcement was enemy propaganda, continued to fight. Others, accepting the reality, prepared for mass suicide. At Rabaul, the commanding officers assembled all personnel and delivered the news with trembling voices. The war was over, Allied forces would soon arrive to process prisoners, and everyone was ordered to cooperate peacefully. For the women, this announcement was a death sentence. They knew, or believed they knew, what would happen when American soldiers arrived. The stories were too numerous, too detailed, too consistently horrible to be mere propaganda. They would be raped, certainly, probably tortured, perhaps killed afterward. The cyanide capsules were distributed quietly, passed from hand to hand with no discussion of their purpose. Everyone understood. Kimiko took hers and sewed it into her uniform. She would wait as long as possible, endure what she could, but when the moment came, she would choose her own death. It was the last freedom available to her, the final assertion of will in a world that had stripped away every other choice. The Australian forces arrived first, units of the 5th Division tasked with securing Rabaul and processing the massive Japanese garrison. They came prepared for resistance but found instead an eerie, orderly surrender. The Japanese troops had stacked their weapons in neat pyramids, formed into units, and waited in formation. The women had been segregated to a separate compound, surrounded by guards to protect them from Australian soldiers who might seek revenge for years of brutal occupation. But the revenge did not come. The Australians were exhausted, ready to go home, focused on processing prisoners efficiently so they could return to lives interrupted by 6 years of war. They issued rations, established roll calls, set up medical stations, and largely ignored the female prisoners beyond ensuring they were housed and fed. It was bureaucratic, impersonal, and utterly confusing to women who had expected violence. Then the Americans arrived. The U.S. military presence at Rabaul was relatively small, support units tasked with logistics and coordination as the occupation transitioned to Australian control. But they brought with them the infrastructure of American military life. Jeeps and trucks, supply depots stocked with goods, portable generators, field kitchens that produced food in quantities that seemed impossible, and radios, dozens of radios, playing constantly as bored soldiers waited for orders to ship out. It was one of these radios, sitting on a crate outside a supply tent adjacent to the female POW compound, that changed everything. September 8th, late afternoon, the rain finally stopped. A young corporal from Brooklyn named Danny Esposito, tired of the humidity and the waiting, switched on his portable radio to catch the Armed Forces Network broadcast. He was hoping for news, maybe a baseball game, anything to break the monotony. Instead, he got music, In the Mood by Glenn Miller, the swing number that had become synonymous with American optimism and energy. A song that captured something essential about the American spirit, brash, confident, joyful in a way that felt almost defiant. The music poured out of the radio, tinny but unmistakable, the saxophone section punching through the humid air, the rhythm driving and infectious. Esposito tapped his foot, humming along, oblivious to the fact that on the other side of the wire, 237 Japanese women were hearing American music for the first time in their lives. Kimiko heard it and froze. She had never encountered anything like it. Japanese military music was martial, regimented, built around the kaka, national anthems designed to inspire unity and sacrifice. Even popular Japanese songs adhered to traditional structures, pentatonic scales, controlled emotional expression. But this American music was something else entirely. Chaotic and controlled simultaneously, wild yet structured, built around rhythms that seemed to insist on movement, on individual expression within collective form. It was music that demanded participation, not passive reception. It was music that celebrated abundance, that took pleasure in its own technical proficiency, that seemed to say, "We have so much that we can afford to be joyful." Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Some covered their ears, as if the music itself was an assault. Others stared in the direction of the sound, their faces showing confusion, fear, and something else, something they had not felt in years: curiosity. One woman, a telegraphist named Sachiko who had worked in the communications bunker, began to cry. Quietly at first, tears simply sliding down her face, and then with more force, her shoulders shaking. Another joined her, and then another, until dozens of women were weeping, the sound of their grief mixing with the incongruous cheerfulness of Glenn Miller's orchestra. Kimiko felt something crack inside her chest. Not pain exactly, but a sudden, overwhelming pressure, as if everything she had been holding in for 3 years demanded release all at once. She thought of the soldiers she had watched die, boys who had never heard music like this, who had been told their entire lives that discipline and sacrifice were the highest virtues, that joy was a luxury the nation could not afford. She thought of her own truncated youth, the dances she had never attended, the romance she had never experienced, the simple pleasures that had been sacrificed to the machinery of total war. And she thought, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that perhaps the reason Japan had lost was not because Americans were barbaric, but because they had never stopped being human. Over the following days, the music continued. The Americans played their radios constantly, a soundtrack of swing, jazz, blues, country, and big band that formed the ambient noise of occupation. The Japanese women, confined to their compound but otherwise unharmed, could not escape it. And slowly, grudgingly, their terror began to give way to confusion, and then to something more complicated. They noticed other things too. The American soldiers were casual, almost shockingly so, laughing and joking even while working, treating their officers with a familiarity that would have been unthinkable in the Imperial Army. They sang along with the radio, often badly, and seemed completely unself-conscious about it. They ate enormous meals, then threw away food, actual edible food, in quantities that made the starving Japanese women stare in disbelief. They wrote letters home and received packages filled with luxuries: chocolate, cigarettes, magazines, photographs. They played baseball in their off hours, shouting and arguing good-naturedly over calls. They did not seem like conquerors. They seemed like boys who wanted to go home. One day, about a week after the initial surrender, a group of American nurses arrived to conduct medical examinations of the female POWs. These women, members of the Army Nurse Corps, were professionals, efficient and brisk, but not unkind. They examined each woman for disease, malnutrition, and injuries, taking notes, dispensing medications, treating ailments that had gone untended for months. Kimiko was examined by Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco. Chun spoke no Japanese and Kimiko spoke no English, but they communicated through gestures and through Chen's gentle efficiency as she treated the infected wounds on Kimiko's hands and feet, legacy of months of inadequate hygiene and medical care. As she worked, Chun hummed along to the radio playing in the background, some tune Kimiko didn't recognize, and the casual domesticity of the moment. One woman caring for another while humming to music was so jarringly normal that Kimiko began to cry again. Chun noticed and paused, looking at her with concern. She said something in English, her tone questioning, kind. Kimiko shook her head, unable to explain, and Chun simply patted her shoulder and continued working, still humming, as if tears were a normal response to having your wounds cleaned and didn't require further comment. Later, Kimiko would identify that moment as the beginning of her transformation. Not the music itself, but the context it created. The suggestion of a world where women hummed while they worked, where care was extended without cruelty, where abundance was so taken for granted that even prisoners received treatment that would have been considered luxury in the world she came from. The symbolic power of the music, particularly the swing and jazz that dominated armed forces network broadcasts, cannot be overstated. To ears trained on the rigid structures of Japanese military music and traditional melodies, American popular music was a revelation and a threat. It was improvisational, built around the tension between individual soloists and the collective band. It was racially integrated in ways that Japanese propaganda insisted were impossible in racist America. It was sexual in its rhythms, celebratory in its tone, utterly unconcerned with the martial virtues that Japanese culture had elevated to sacred status. Most subversively, it was music that insisted on joy as a birthright, not a reward for sacrifice. It was music that said, "Life is meant to be lived, not merely endured." For women who had been taught that their worth was measured entirely in service to others, that pleasure was selfish, that individual expression was a form of disloyalty, this was a revolutionary concept. Sachiko, the telegraphist who had cried at the first sound of "In the Mood," found herself drawn to the music despite herself. She began to sit near the fence during the day, as close to the American compound as she could get, listening. She couldn't understand the lyrics when singers like Ella Fitzgerald or Frank Sinatra came on, but she didn't need to. The music communicated something beyond language, a sense of possibility, of individual identity, of a world where a woman's voice could be powerful and celebrated rather than suppressed and ignored. One afternoon, an American soldier noticed her sitting by the fence and, on impulse, turned up his radio and angled it toward her. He smiled and gave her a thumbs up before walking away. It was a tiny gesture, cost him nothing, but Sachiko felt it like a seismic shift. The enemy had noticed her, had acknowledged her existence as something other than a category or a problem, and had shared his music with her not from any strategic motive but from simple, casual generosity. She sat there for an hour, listening to songs whose titles she would never know, and when she returned to the barracks that night, she told the others what had happened. Some dismissed it as a trick, psychological warfare designed to soften them up for some future exploitation. But others, including Kimiko, heard in the story a different possibility. That perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told, that perhaps the very concept of enemy was more complicated than the simple binary of us versus them. As weeks passed and the women realized they were not going to be executed or abused, the psychological strain began to manifest in different ways. Some clung more desperately to the old certainties, insisting that the Americans' restraint was temporary, that the true horror would come once the world stopped watching. Others, like Ilsa in the previous tale, could not reconcile their ideology with the observable reality and retreated into silence, unable to process the cognitive dissonance. But a significant number, including Kimiko and Sachiko, began the slow, painful process of ideological revision. They started by acknowledging small facts. The Americans had more food because their economy was more productive. The Americans seemed less disciplined because their system didn't require the same level of coercion. The Americans played music constantly because they could afford the leisure and the technology. Each small acknowledgement chipped away at the larger narrative until the whole structure began to totter. The music was central to this process because it was ubiquitous and undeniable. You could argue about economic systems or political philosophy, could dismiss differences as matters of cultural preference. But you couldn't ignore the sheer exuberant vitality of American music, the way it seemed to bubble up from some inexhaustible well of creative energy. It spoke to something deeper than politics, a fundamental orientation toward life as something to be celebrated rather than endured, toward individual expression as a value rather than a threat. In late September, the Americans organized a concert for their own troops, a small stage set up in the central compound, a visiting USO troop that had been touring the Pacific, performing for soldiers before they shipped home. The Japanese women could hear it from their compound, could see the lights and the shadows of soldiers moving, could hear the applause and laughter that erupted at intervals. The headliner was a jazz singer, a black woman whose voice carried across the night air with a power and authority that seemed to emanate from some source beyond mere human capacity. She sang "Stormy Weather," her voice bending and shaping the melody with an improvisational freedom that made the song both deeply personal and universally resonant. The Japanese women listened in silence, transfixed, and when the song ended and the Americans erupted in cheers, Several of the women found themselves applauding too, quietly, almost unconsciously, before realizing what they were doing and stopping in confusion. Kimiko applauded. She didn't stop. She clapped until her hands stung, tears streaming down her face, applauding not just the singer but everything the performance represented. The confidence to stand alone before a crowd, the freedom to interpret a song in your own way, the celebration of individual talent, the fact that a black woman could command the attention and respect of white soldiers in a way that contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had said about American racism and social chaos. She was applauding the world she had been denied, the life she might have lived if she had been born somewhere else, someone else. And she was mourning, deeply and completely, for the years sacrificed to a system that had promised glory and delivered only ash. In October, the repatriation process began. Japanese prisoners were documented, interviewed, and prepared for transport back to Japan. The women faced an uncertain future, returning to a defeated nation, to cities destroyed by firebombing, to a society that would likely view them with suspicion for having survived capture. Women who had been prisoners, even through no fault of their own, carried a stigma that would follow them for life. Some chose to remain silent about their experiences, to invent cover stories, to disappear into the anonymity of a shattered nation trying to rebuild. Before they left, the American commander authorized a small gesture. Each female prisoner was given a care package, standard military issue, containing basic supplies for the journey home. Inside were rations, soap, a blanket, and, inexplicably, a small harmonica with a sheet of paper showing basic instructions for how to play. The harmonicas were surplus, thousands of them produced for morale purposes and now being distributed as the military drew down. The officer who authorized their distribution probably gave it no more thought than any other logistical decision. But to the Japanese women, the harmonica was yet another incomprehensible expression of American abundance. Even in a care package for enemy prisoners, there was room for music, for the possibility of joy. Kimiko held hers carefully, as if it were made of glass. She had never played a musical instrument, had no particular musical talent. But that night, alone in the barracks, she brought it to her lips and blew a tentative note. It was off-key, amateurish, but it was sound, vibration, the physical manifestation of breath transformed into something more than breath. She tried another note, and slowly, clumsily, began to pick out a melody, something half-remembered from the radio, probably wrong, certainly unrecognizable, but hers. Around her, other women were doing the same. A chorus of wavering, uncertain notes filling the barracks, the sound of women who had spent years in silence finding their voices, however imperfectly. They sounded terrible, discordant and clumsy. They sounded beautiful. They sounded human. Kimiko Tanaka returned to Japan in November 1945, landing in Yokohama to find a country transformed beyond recognition. The cities were rubble, the economy non-existent, the population traumatized and starving. The emperor had been reduced from a living god to a constitutional figurehead. The entire ideological structure that had shaped Japanese society for decades had collapsed, leaving a vacuum filled with confusion, shame, and the desperate need to survive. She never told anyone she had been a prisoner. She claimed she had spent the war years working in a factory in Osaka, a common enough story that no one questioned it. She found work as a nurse again in a clinic serving the poor districts, and she worked there for 35 years, treating children and elderly, asking no payment from those who couldn't afford it, living in a small apartment that she filled with music. She kept the harmonica. She never learned to play it well, but she practiced, and over the years she could manage a few simple songs, melodies she had heard on that radio in Rabaul, tunes whose names she never learned but whose rhythms had lodged in her soul like seeds in fertile ground. When she played, alone in her apartment, she thought about the American soldier who had turned up his radio for Sachiko, about Lieutenant Chen humming as she cleaned wounds, about the jazz singer whose voice had carried across a compound in New Guinea and announced that there were ways of being human she had never imagined. She never married, never had children. She lived quietly, a ghost of a different history, carrying within her the memory of music as revelation, as revolution, as the sound of a freedom so absolute that even prisoners were given the tools to create it. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, a researcher interviewing former military nurses found Kimiko and asked about her experiences. She spoke for several hours, her voice steady, her memory precise. She described the hospital at Rabaul, the surrender, the compound, the terror, the music. And she described what the music had meant, how it had shattered her certainty, how it had revealed the possibility of a different kind of strength. Not the strength of discipline and sacrifice, but the strength of abundance and joy, the confidence to celebrate being alive even in the midst of hardship. The researcher asked if she had forgiven America for the war. Kimiko thought carefully before responding. Forgiveness is not the right word. I learned that the question itself was wrong. It was not about forgiving America. It was about understanding that I had been lied to, that my country had built a system on suppression and called it strength, on scarcity and called it purity, on silence and called it discipline. America had abundance, and rather than hoarding it, they shared it: food, medicine, music. Even with prisoners, even with people who had fought to destroy them. That is not something to forgive. That is something to learn from. She died in 1998, at the age of 76, and in her will, she left a small bequest to a music education program for underprivileged children. The harmonica she kept until the end, and it was buried with her, a talisman of transformation, a symbol of the moment when sound became the solvent that dissolved ideology and revealed the bedrock of common humanity beneath. Sachiko, the telegraphist who had sat by the fence, returned to Japan and became a teacher. She taught English, having learned it painstakingly in the decades after the war, driven by the desire to understand the words to the songs she had heard. She was not a particularly good teacher. Her pronunciation was off, her grammar occasionally shaky, but she was beloved by her students because she taught language not as a set of rules but as a doorway to other ways of thinking, other ways of being. In her classroom, she kept a record player and she played American music for her students, everything from Glenn Miller to Elvis Presley to the Beatles, explaining that language was not just words but rhythm and tone and the cultural context that shaped expression. She told them about sitting by a fence in New Guinea, listening to music from an enemy's radio, and learning that the enemy was not what she had been taught. Some of her students went on to become musicians, others translators, others simply people who carried with them the lesson that curiosity is more valuable than certainty, that the willingness to listen, truly listen, to another culture is the beginning of wisdom. She never spoke of the war publicly, never joined veterans organizations or participated in commemorations. But in her classroom, in the music she played and the stories she told, she waged a quiet campaign against the ideologies that had produced the war, teaching each new generation that strength comes not from suppression but from openness, not from purity but from mixing and blending, not from silence but from the cacophony of many voices raised in joyful, discordant, undeniably human song. The epilogue of this story is not about individual redemption, because the women who heard that music and wept were not personally responsible for the war crimes and atrocities committed by Imperial Japan. They were participants in the system, complicit through their service, but they were also victims of that system, their lives narrowed and constrained by an ideology that valued them only as instruments of the state. But their story matters because it illustrates a truth that transcends the specific history of World War II, that culture is political, that art is never neutral, that the music a society produces reveals its deepest values in ways that no amount of propaganda can obscure. The Americans who played swing and jazz on their radios were not engaged in psychological warfare, at least not consciously. They were simply being themselves, and in that unself-conscious expression of identity, they communicated something more powerful than any strategic bombing campaign or military occupation could achieve. They communicated that democracy, for all its flaws and contradictions, produced a culture of abundance and creativity that totalitarianism could never match. They communicated that individual freedom, far from being a weakness that undermined collective strength, was the wellspring of the innovation and vitality that made collective strength possible. They communicated that joy was not a luxury to be rationed but a fundamental human right, and that a society secure enough in its values to extend that right even to its enemies was a society built on foundations that could weather any storm. The music, the brassy confidence of big band swing, the improvisational brilliance of jazz, the vernacular authenticity of blues and country, was America's secret weapon, more effective than any bomb because it bypassed rational defenses and spoke directly to the emotional and spiritual hunger of people who had been told their entire lives that discipline and sacrifice were the highest virtues. It said, in a language that transcended words, "There is another way to live. There is abundance enough for everyone. There is room in this world for individual expression and collective harmony, for structure and improvisation, for seriousness and joy." The Japanese women who heard that music and cried were mourning the lives they had not been allowed to live, the pleasures they had been taught to despise, the selves they had been forbidden to become. But they were also, in that moment of tears and revelation, beginning the long journey toward a different understanding of what it meant to be human, to be free, to live in a world where music was not a luxury but a necessity, not a reward but a right. The harmonica, that small, cheap instrument distributed almost as an afterthought, became the symbol of this transformation. Unlike the lipstick of the German nurses, which represented femininity and dignity, or the chocolate bar of the German soldiers, which represented material abundance, the harmonica represented something more abstract and more fundamental. The democratization of creativity, the idea that everyone, even the most powerless, even those who had been enemies, had the right and the capacity to make music, to transform breath into beauty, to participate in the ongoing creation of culture. It was a small gift, cost almost nothing, would have been forgotten by the Americans who authorized its distribution within days. But for the women who received it, it was a key that unlocked a door they had not known existed, a door that led to a world where worth was not measured by obedience, where strength included gentleness, where victory included mercy, where the sound of a badly played harmonica was not a failure but an attempt, and the attempt itself was worthy of celebration. The music played on. The women wept, and then they dried their tears, and then they went home to a broken nation and tried to build something better from the ruins. They did not all succeed. History is not a narrative of inevitable progress, and many of them lived hard lives, marked by poverty and loss and the lingering trauma of what they had witnessed and endured. But they carried with them the memory of music filtering through canvas, of a voice raised in song, of the moment when sound revealed that everything they had been taught was a lie, and that the truth, complicated, contradictory, joyful, and free, was waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to listen. This is the story of female POWs who cried when they heard American music for the first time. It is a story about sound and ideology, about the moment when melody becomes revelation, when rhythm becomes resistance, when the simple act of playing a radio becomes a declaration of values more powerful than any weapon. It is a story about the quiet, persistent power of culture to transform consciousness, about the ways that art smuggles truth past the barricades of propaganda, about the possibility of change even in the most unlikely circumstances. It is a story worth remembering, because in the end, the battles we win with weapons are temporary, but the battles we win with music, with art, with the patient, generous extension of our culture to even those who have been our enemies, these victories endure. They plant seeds that take decades to grow, that bloom in unexpected places, that produce fruit long after the warriors have gone home and the treaties have been signed. Kimiko Tanaka died with a harmonica in her hands, and somewhere in Japan, a student she taught 40 years ago teaches her own students now, plays them music, tells them to listen not just with their ears but with their hearts, tells them that the world is larger and stranger and more wonderful than any ideology can capture, and that the first step toward wisdom is the willingness to be surprised. The music plays on, and in that music, in the swing and sway of it, in the improvisation and the joy, in the insistent rhythm that says life is meant to be lived and celebrated and shared, there lives the possibility of a world where former enemies become friends, where abundance replaces scarcity, where the sound of laughter is more common than the sound of marching boots. It is a possibility worth fighting for, worth living for, worth singing for, even badly, even imperfectly, even with the trembling uncertainty of someone who has just learned that everything they believed was wrong, and that the truth, when it finally arrives, sounds like music.